Well, thank you very much, Kyla, for a very warm introduction. We're very pleased that we're able to get something from our writings. This is always a worry for those of us who work in the early period, that no one else, except maybe a dozen of our friends, read our books or articles. So it's nice to know that there are a few others who are interested in what we do. We'd also like to thank the Golay Committee for inviting both of us here. We've done things together, we've done things separately, but it's always nice to be recognized together. And we hope that our presentation tonight will also show you the way that we work together when we have major projects such as writing a regional history or even a national history. And finally, I'd like to thank all of our wonderful friends from way back. I remember the first time I came to Cornell to do my PhD was in 1966. It's almost 50 years ago. And it's nice to see that the people that we knew then, there are still some of us around. And it's been wonderful to see you all here. And I look forward to being able to catch up on the 50 years that have passed. So today, what we'll be doing is I'll begin the talk, and Barbara will end it. But we've talked through the talk itself, what we wanted to cover, and so we will talk for about an hour, and then we'll have a question and answer period for about a half hour. So let's begin with looking at the regional and local histories. And one of the things we found when looking through the list of Golay speakers in the past, that there was considerable interest in historiography of Southeast Asia. And so we felt that this was something that we could talk about from our very recent experience of completing the history of early modern Southeast Asia, as well as the third edition of the history of Malaysia. Now, there are certain things that we have always tried to do in both of these histories. One is to ignore the current or contemporary political boundaries. Even though we're writing the history of Malaysia, we tried, whenever it was feasible, to talk about the area in terms of meaningful units. And so we didn't hold the political boundaries as a place where we stopped. And I was reminded by what Barbara had asked was looking at a project once where she said, if you look at the Journal of Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, you'd think that there were special spiders only in Johor or special birds only in Pahang, because people wrote about the birds in Johor or animals in Pahang. People tended to kind of focus on a specific area in which they were based. And so we tried to avoid this. And this was possible mainly because many of the things that we talked about many of the places that we talked about did not have boundaries in the early period. And so it was possible then to move, for example, into southern Thailand or into across the straits into Indonesia, or even into the Indonesian Kalimantan, for example. Now, one of the things that has really stimulated the kind of inquiries that we have in our writing is something that O.W. Walters, our mentor, always told us. And what he said is that the aim of history is to look at what is happening in a comparative perspective. So what is happening in Southeast Asia is one region, one area, but you cannot study that area in isolation. What you have to do is to link it to what is also happening elsewhere. Nevertheless, he said, you cannot make generalizations unless you do the work. So you've got to build, you've got to create the building blocks. And so he always encouraged us to work in local history. I think one of his favorite sayings was, do not pick flowers from other people's gardens. And so we're hoping that we haven't done that too often, and that we've done our own planting and been able to then use some of our own research in order to write the histories that we have. And so we've tried in both the national history as well as in regional history to try to address larger questions. And this has been particularly interesting with regard to the early modern history of Southeast Asia, mainly because what we discovered is that while there are all these features that characterize early modern Southeast Asia, many of them were also found elsewhere in the early modern world, and we talked about that, and Barbara will talk about that a little more later in this lecture. And so these are some of the concerns that have governed our way of thinking about these histories. So if you look at both of these projects, we have tried to look at the past without being bound by contemporary political boundaries. But another thing that we were very aware of as a result of our own research is to try to move away from focusing only on the major political centers in Southeast Asia. There is a danger that because the sources are very plentiful for major centers, that one forgets about others on the periphery or those who have fewer written sources. And so you'll find in both our history of Malaysia as well as in our history of modern Southeast Asia, more inclusion of groups such as the Orang Laut, or the Sea Peoples, or the Sama Bajau, Sea Peoples as well, or the Orang Asli, the forest people, and those who live in the hills. We've tried to incorporate a number of studies in the hill areas, also basing some of our observations on Jim Scott's work, but also on a number of works written by the Germans, Grabowski, for example, which has given us a lot more to think about in terms of the hill groups. And so we've tried to think about different ways in which the history of Southeast Asia was organized. You can't think simply in terms of kingdoms, but there are different types of polities, different types of organizations that were operating and significant in the early modern period. Another thing that drew the study of Malaysia as well as Southeast Asia together was trade. And I don't think one can overestimate the importance of trade to Southeast Asia as well as to Malaysia. And one of the reasons, of course, is the location of Southeast Asia. And one of the things that I tend to do when I teach early modern Southeast Asia is to point out that Southeast Asia forms almost a point of blockage, really, between the civilizations in East Asia and civilizations in West Asia and Europe. That in the past, the only way that one could move between these two major areas of civilization was through Southeast Asia. And the area that was most known in the early period, until probably the 16th or 17th century, was the Straits of Malacca. And so it was the movement of trade and the response of the local people to trade that have been a major factor in the our thinking about Southeast Asia. So let me just turn now to Malaysia and look at writing Malaysia for the third time. We thought we'd never go that far. The first one was hard enough and it was exhausting enough, and we thought we'd never do it again. But we were convinced or cajoled into doing the other two. So one of the ways in which we could justify writing a history of Malaysia, and when we first wrote it, we were very young. We just had recently got our PhDs because the first edition was in 1981. But the way we justified it, and one of the reasons why we were asked to do it by Professor Wang Gungwu is because he explained many people could write the history of Malaysia for the modern period, from 19th century onward, but very few could write it from the perspective of an earlier period. And so this is what we decided we could do. We could give more information, a little different perspective on the history if we began much earlier. So you'll see in our history, we begin really very early, and there's a very substantial section of our book on the pre-19th century period. The other thing that we felt that we could contribute was the fact that if you read many of the histories of Malaysia, Borneo is oftentimes left out or added as an afterthought. And so what we tried to do was to show how Sabah and Sarawak, the two Borneo states of Malaysia, were part of the evolution, the development of Malaysian history. And so we think we've done that. Now, one of the things we've thought about when we wrote the history was, what is the point of this whole history that we are writing? Because sometimes you find histories that have a whole lot of projects or a whole lot of events, description of events, a whole lot of people, and it just begins and ends. And so we decided from very early on that we needed a focus. And so what we decided the focus would be history of the people who were occupying that region for a very long period of time. In the past, they were called Malays, but what we have tried to show, as in my book that I talked about, this whole idea of ethnicity and identity is always shifting. And so we try to be aware of the shifting ideas of ethnicity and identity to demonstrate, particularly in this last edition, which will be appearing next year, that the Malays who are Malays today were certainly not the Malays who were there in an earlier period. And so what we've done now then is to write a history where we are focusing on the peoples who were living around the Straits of Malacca, whom we call Malays. But these Malays were not simply the Malays of the peninsula. There were Malays who were living also on the east coast of Sumatra, as well as in the southwest areas of Borneo. So one of my latest kind of research, and I think maybe I'll write an article, is looking at the Malay groups along the southwest Borneo area, along the Kapuas River. And there you find interesting differences with the Malays along the Straits of Malacca. And so this is the point that we wanted to make as well, that things do change and that one has to be sensitive to the kind of shifts and changes of meanings of ethnicities over the centuries. And this has become much clearer now in our third edition. So if you look at the organization of our work, we've used a chronological framework mainly because we intended it as a textbook, and we found that from years of teaching that if you teach a course thematically, people don't have anything to hold on to. They can't distinguish between what might have happened in the very early period and what is happening today, because they don't have that kind of chronology. So we thought we'd use a chronology rather than a thematic division. However, we would pick up themes which we would point out to the readers. And one of the other things that we're aware of is the fact that so many of the histories follow a framework where they're using the centuries because it's so much easier. We tried to say, why don't we think in terms of what was significant in the areas that we're working on and use that as a guide to where the divisions should lie. And interestingly enough, if you look at the major divisions where we think watersheds happen in Malaysian history, they actually coincided with a lot of the divisions by centuries. 1511, 1699, 1824. 1909, people might not be aware of. This is when the northern Malay states were taken by the British from Thailand and made part of British Malaya. And 2003 is a more modern date that we chose because it was the end of Mahathir's governor as Prime Minister of Malaysia after 22 years, the longest serving prime minister, and it was during his tenure of office that so many changes occurred. And so we felt that this would be an important natural division. And also we began each chapter with a discussion of the sources. Because what we felt reading other histories of Malaysia, that we didn't have a sense of the difficulty and why for example, the questions we had were, why did they do this? Why did they do that? It's very easy to ask these questions if you don't know what are some of the difficulties that are faced by historians because of either the lack of sources or some other kind of problem. And so we began each chapter with a discussion of the kind of sources that we use in order to reconstruct the history of these areas. And I think this has been helpful. Some of our students have always commented on the fact that it helped them realize that they couldn't ask the kind of questions sometimes they asked of the early modern period, mainly because there were no answers. If you're relying on sources which don't really have a beginning and end, they're just pieces that you link together and try to make sense of, then it's very difficult to have a very close, coherent narrative from the beginning to the end. And also we have tried then to make each of the editions relevant for the time when the book appeared. And so we highlighted certain things. For example, in the second edition, we realized that we had very little on the environment, but by the second edition in 1999, the environmental issue was very strong. And so we tried to highlight this more, and we did that with Islam as well. And in this third edition, we found that Islamization of Malaysia is a very, very crucial question now in the history. And so we have again focused on Islam, but even more so than we did in the past. And because of the kind of problems that have risen as a result of Mahathir's governance, we have also focused on human rights, the problems of human rights in Malaysia, and the rise of a large number of activist groups in response to some of the methods used by the government. And so you see in the third edition an emergence of a much stronger civil society than was there before, but a very necessary counter to the strong Islamization that is occurring today. So, as I point out, in this organization, we try to deal with this type of problem. So what has changed? I just want to show the book. In this yellow book, for those of you who know, the Malays, when we asked them, do you have the second edition? They said, oh no, we don't have the second edition. We have the Kitab Kuning. So they say, wow, a Kitab Kuning. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, oftentimes they use it in the pesantren in Indonesia to talk about the holy books, Kitab Kuning, with these yellow pages and stuff. Well, maybe our book has reached that status. But talk about the cover, which is in a yellow book. And in the second one, we tried to find also a cover that would fit what we were trying to do, which was that you had some of the traditional elements within society against the backdrop of also colonialism. And so here we have a mosque and a former administrative center for the judiciary. And then in the third one, this is what we suggested as a book cover. We're not sure they're going to take it. I took it from the light rail as we were going by there. And what it was is a modern mosque, but in the back is development. And one of the themes of our third edition is also developmentalism. How, because of the success of development and the economy in Malaysia, it has made people much more tolerant of some of the very oppressive acts undertaken by the government, because they're afraid to change the government for fear of losing the type of progress that they've made in Malaysia. And so in the first edition, we're young, and we're very optimistic. It was just in the middle of the new economic policy, which was an affirmative action policy. And when we first went to Malaysia in the early 70s, we were struck by the fact that there was so little Malay spoken. That in Kuala Lumpur, you could hear Chinese and English, and Indian dialects and so forth, Indian languages, but not Malay. And so when they talked about affirmative action, we felt that this was good. And we saw some of the early results of the new economic policy, and so we were very positive. And they were already talking about the new Malaysian that would emerge at the end of the new economic policy in 1990, after 20 years. Now, the second was written in 1999. So the NEP, the new economic policy, had come and gone, and they still had not achieved that new Malaysia. And there were problems that had arisen in the second half of the NEP, which made us a little bit more wary. And it was also the period when Mahathir had come to power in 1981, and he was already undertaking acts that were undermining civil society. And so we were a lot less sanguine in the second edition. Now, the third edition, things have really changed. We spent the summer last year in Malaysia, and we are far less positive about what is going on. And what we see now, and we added an afterword in the third edition, maybe because we don't think we'll live long enough to write the fourth edition. So this is our last word on the subject. We are a lot more tentative about the future of this multicultural country. And what we're looking at now is the increased Islamization, which is coming about even though within the Constitution itself, it states very clearly that Islam is the official religion, but other religions can be practiced openly and in harmony. And so there are some very difficult things that are happening at the moment, which we feel needs to be addressed. And so what we're hoping is that this third edition is going to be read by some. My wife always says that one of the problems, of course, is that when you go to the bookstore and you see stacks and stacks of the second edition is still unsold, one wonders whether anybody is reading it. But we're hoping that this will be a book that some of these people can use in order to challenge some of the statements made by people in the country as well as in the government about their own history, which oftentimes are not based on factual material, but because of religious and political reasons. And so we believe that things have been changing, but there is a glimmer of hope in the sense that there is a growing middle class across the ethnic divide, and we've seen some positive signs in the last two elections in 2008 and 2013, and a genuine two-party system which may arise. And so we're hoping that perhaps this rising middle class might be the opening to kind of change what is going on in Malaysia. So I think I've taken enough time, so I'll just turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you all again for coming. And I am going to talk about the second project which we just finished, and this is the cover, the history of early modern Southeast Asia. Right. Can you all hear me? Is that okay? Sometimes, there were many times in fact, when we thought, why did we agree to do this? It's not easy, but it took us a long time, but we persevered because we felt that it was very important for Southeast Asia, and in a sense we always do missions, you know, that you're kind of persuading the rest of the world that the place you've spent 50 years studying is worth it. And so we wanted to write something that would matter, that would make a difference, and we wanted to write a history that would be interesting to people who knew a lot already, and there are many people in this room, most of you fall into that category, that students could read it, but specialists could read it as well. we wanted to write a book, as Leonard said before, that would move beyond the major centres, that would incorporate people, the peoples without history, as Eric Wolf said. They do have a history. It's just not easily recovered, especially in written form. And finally, we felt that there was a new field developing. Most of you will be looking at job applications and advertisements for positions will see words like world history or global history appearing. This is a relatively new field, and Southeast Asia has to be part of it. And so we wanted to write a book that could be used by people in Slippery Rock College or wherever it is who are trying to do a world history course. So, of course, we had two major issues. One of them was the need. Now, all of us have encountered the great debate about Southeast Asia and the term, and I'm not going to bore you with that now. But we begin the book with the assumption that there is some place that we've called Southeast Asia, even though the term itself is problematic, is dubious, its origins are dubious. But there is a place that we feel we can call Southeast Asia. Given that, however, there is a huge difference historiographically and historically between the experience of the island areas and the mainland. You have to be very careful about generalising. And we've tried to take that on board very much in this book. And as Leonard said before, particularly because of Walter's training, and I feel coming back here after such a long time, because he was here last time we came back in '91, his intellectual presence is very much with us. And he always talked about sub-regions. You know, you have to think about sub-regions in the area. And so we've approached the book in terms of sub-regions. We've called them zones. We've taken that word from our colleague Victor Lieberman, who looked at the mainland Southeast Asia in those terms. And so just to give you a sense of how this is how we've drawn up those zones. And you can see that in some that they don't all correlate with contemporary political boundaries. Perhaps the most obvious one is the Northern Archipelago zone, but I'll talk a little bit about this later. But one of the strengths of the book is, I think, that in this book, probably for the first time, the Eastern Archipelago gets the attention it deserves. It's been a very difficult area, this area from Sulawesi through to the Bird's Head. It's been a very difficult place to deal with because there were very few large kingdoms. And Leonard is working on that now. His next book will be a history of this area. But this is an area where it functioned as a unit, but without the dominance, you could say Makassar and Ternate and Tidore, but basically it functioned without the dominance of large ports and large areas. So we accepted that there was a Southeast Asia, with different coverage, different areas, but the second problem is the whole question of early modern. I mean, what is modern? What's early? It's a very problematic term. But we saw the period between what you might call the classical states and the quote-unquote colonial period, with Thailand accepted. That's a period. So you can call it period X. But early modern is increasingly accepted through, it was first expressed in the 1920s, adopted in America first, then particularly in Europe, but now you see histories of early modern Japan, histories of early modern China, often used without a lot of thought about what early modern actually means. And we tried to think very seriously about what is there a period that you can call, for want of a better term, early modern in Southeast Asia. And we came to the conclusion that yes, there was. And we saw in that period, and we didn't go to the sources with a kind of agenda. We didn't go thinking we were going to, this was a feature of the early modern period, we're going to find it here. No, but in a sense, the sources, well, one of our medieval scholars, friends, once said, the sources whisper to you. And they do. You've got to just listen carefully. And sometimes they shout at you. One of the big shouts was the strengthening of global connections. And perhaps that's most clearly exemplified in the early modern period with the galleon trade that linked, the last global link that linked Manila to Acapulco. And by that encircled then the globe. And there are many examples you can list of these new global connections. Of course, we know about Chinese, Indians, and Europeans coming to Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asians themselves were also traveling, going to places, going to Versailles, going to The Hague. And one of my favorite examples is the two envoys from Banten who went to London in the 1680s, and they went to Windsor Castle, they were given a knighthood, and then, as a special treat, they were taken to the globe to see Shakespeare's The Tempest. I'm just wondering what they thought of that when they saw that play. So global connections are strengthened. There are local responses to new trading opportunities. We can think, for example, of the response of Vietnamese and Thai ceramics to the Ming Gap, that they entered into that opening in the trading world. We can think of Makassar's responses to changes in the Chinese cuisine when tripang or bechamel became a valued item in the Chinese diet, and they extended their links into northern Australia in search of that particular valued item. And in fact, it's usually dated from the 18th century, but in fact they've now found some rock carvings in northern Australia that suggest that Makassarese or some Abajau, some groups were reaching there as early as the 17th century. The increased penetration of the world religions, particularly, of course, Islam and Christianity, but also the spread of Buddhism, the inculcation of Confucian ideas, introduced and localized in so many different ways. And this is a topic that interests me particularly, but even elements like the walking Buddha in Sukhothai, something that you don't find anywhere else, this attention to specifics, the way people understood their area, the rethinking of the landscape in terms of sacred spots, that the Buddha himself walked here, or this particular place was where an image of the Madonna was found, and so this makes it a very special place. And so the landscape becomes reconfigured often in terms of how people rethink their relationship to the cosmos, to their own origins. And in this period too, we also see knowledge transfer. And it's not at all one way. There's been a lot of attention to weaponry, to ammunition, and how that was transferred from European to local Southeast Asians. But we know a lot about how local Southeast Asians were reconstructing weaponry to suit their own needs, to deal with humidity, to deal with particular situations. The area in which the knowledge transfer from Southeast Asians to Europeans is most marked, of course, is in medical and botanical knowledge. And of course, we all know about Rumphius and his wife, a local woman who was an informant. But Christina Scott has done a tremendous amount of work on botanical transfers in the 18th century, and it's very clear that there was a tremendous amount of information being relayed from Southeast Asian the Asians themselves. And one of the most dramatic areas of change in this period is demographic. So, of course, the figures for the Philippines are best because they have parish records. And so we can see, as Linda Newson has shown, we can see that actually in the late 16th and 17th century, there was a real decline in population because of smallpox, because of epidemics that only began to rise again in the 18th century. But we can also see other kinds of mobility. Mobility as voluntary, as people move to places of trade or harbours, they want to go there, they're looking for jobs. But there's also a much darker side of mobility. There's massive increase in slavery, massive, and the European records are particularly useful here because they tell you how many numbers of people brought from present-day Rakhine, for example, or from Papua. They can give you some figures of how many thousands of people were forcibly moved from one place to another. War captives who were transferred from one place to another. These are, and these bring, in a sense, an aspect of Southeast Asian history that I think Francis Bradley has talked about, that has been cruelty. And there's a lot of cruelty around too that's involved with this mobility of people and this forced movement. But there's also the movement means the development of hybrid groups like the so-called black Portuguese, the mixed Portuguese local marriages, the Peranakan groups, a whole groups of people who move between two cultures and are valued because they have feet in two cultures. It's only really in the late 18th, 19th century that the so-called half-caste, as the British called it, you start seeing in the records, send me no more half-castes, kind of a European perception that these people are somehow less trustworthy. But that was not the case in the period that we're talking about. So, just to give you a sense, as Leonard went through the organisation of our History of Malaysia, so we spent quite a lot of time thinking about how we would organise it. So the first chapter is about geography, but absolutely essential to our understanding of this period is the importance of geography as part of its history. It's not just a background chapter and then you can kind of move on and forget about it. It has to be there all the time. And it's very important for people to understand not just temperatures and climates, but the kind of products and goods that were so important to trade. And chapter 2 gives some background. We felt that you can't just jump in at where we chose to draw the line for the early modern period, which was about 1430, round about that time. But then in the subsequent chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, we divided them chronologically. We have a short introduction that tries to give the world stage, what's happening in the world right now. And we try, and the global events that influence Southeast Asia. Then we have a larger section on the general features, what we see as the general features of the period that we're discussing. And the chronology is largely century-oriented, but as Leonard said, we've tried to choose dates that are meaningful regionally as far as we can. And that section on the general features, I'll show you an example in a minute, is followed then by a detailed discussion of the history of each zone and a concluding overview. So if you just wanted to teach about Thailand, the central mainland, you could just go through the book and read those sections if you wanted. So just a reminder of where it is. So for example, this is from chapter 5. So we have an introductory section at the beginning talking about what was happening in the 17th century worldwide, the arrival of the opening of the closure of Japanese trade, for example. We introduce the new and old actors, the Chinese, Indians, but new actors, the Dutch and the British. And we talk about slavery and the mobility of human labour, changes to the physical environment, because one of the features of the early modern period is physical change to the environment. And you could see that particularly in eastern Indonesia, where the sandalwood just disappears, but also elsewhere, the massive destruction of deer in mainland Southeast Asia, especially after Taiwan was emptied out. And so the changes to the physical environment were a very substantial feature. Even the Dutch themselves were noticing that the teak in eastern Java was disappearing, and they tried to call a halt to the destruction of these trees without much success. Local rulers also tried to respond to try to protect their environment, again with limited success. And then we've divided the chapters in terms of island and mainland because, as I said before, we were very conscious. We didn't want to put them. There were differences, and those differences do become evident. We bring them together in a conclusion. They become increasingly evident as time goes on. So, when we look over this entire, a long period of time, or around 400 years, what do we see? The features I've outlined to you earlier, but this escalating global engagement. And if I could just go back to this picture of the ruler of Tidore in the 17th century, you can see that his jacket here is made in the Dutch style, but textile experts tell me that this embroidery here is copied from fabrics that come from Persia, and it's been painted by an unknown Dutch artist. We're at the exhibition of Philippine gold in Asia Society a couple of days ago, and this is very, very similar to the gold chains that were made in the Philippines and worn by Datus there. So there's these kind of global connections are very much a feature of this period. But although we can see, particularly in the mainland, we can see these centralizing tendencies. States become more powerful, their area of control becomes much larger. Nonetheless, we can still see these networks of smaller, independent polities throughout areas where we can see the shadowy outlines of modern Thailand or modern Myanmar. And within these networks, local loyalties remain very strong. So that, for example, even in 1857, the ruler of Chiang Mai can say, I am the ruler of 85 different polities, and quite something that's quite different from the perspective from Bangkok. Now, this sense of autonomy and independence is very strong. In the early 19th century, European observers often thought that Ligor, Nakhon Si Thammarat, was an independent country because of that sense of independence and autonomy. But as the 18th century advances, as the turn of the century comes, the early 19th century, we can see that the room for local agencies, the room to manoeuvre, is steadily decreasing. It's becoming steadily smaller. As European imperialism, European territorialism gains hold. And the most egregious example of that, probably, to turn back to Leonard's mention of the Malacca Straits, is the Anglo-Dutch Agreement of 1824, which divided the Malacca Straits, which had previously operated really as a lake connecting East Coast Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, divided that and thus formed the basis for the modern boundary between Indonesia and Malaysia. And the bewilderment that many Malays felt when they knew of that is no better conveyed than in the words of the Bendahara of Pahang, when he said, "We do not understand the dispensation of Allah, but He has allowed this to happen, parting brother from brother, father from son, and friend from friend." And in many of the sources that we looked at for this period, we could see a sense of puzzlement, bewilderment at the kind of changes that were occurring. There was still confidence that had not been undermined completely, but there was very much a sense that change was on the way. And in that sense, we feel that the early modern period was coming to an end. So just as a final comment, I mentioned before about the sources whispering to you. And we've always told our students, you can't go to the sources with an agenda. You can't say, this is my hypothesis. I'm going to find the information that supports that. Because you will, probably. You've got to go to your sources with an open mind. But it was quite interesting and, in fact, in many ways amazing to us that when we felt that we had located what made early modern Southeast Asia different. The features we located were very similar to what other historians working on other parts of the world had located there as well. So we felt pleased about that. But, and that it strengthened our feeling that a knowledge or a willingness to engage in comparative history is very important, even if it means stepping outside your comfort zone, even if you make mistakes, even if you say things that a specialist in some other area will say it's not so. It still stimulates you to think, what are the differences, what are the similarities? And these global connections and comparative histories are what are driving our thinking. And above all, I think in the 21st century, our historians now are extraordinarily lucky. When we tell our students we can remember the days before photocopying, there's a lot of technological change that's taken place. And now there are so many sources available online through digitization, new research, new methodologies. And so the study of Southeast Asia continues to be exciting, interesting, and the wonderful thing about it, you learn something new, I feel. You learn something new every day that you didn't know before. And one of the just to our very last slide, I just saw these the other day. This is from an article by Rick Golay, whom some of you know, working on a Jesuit botanist in the Philippines in the 17th century. But I thought this was the tarsia, the Philippines tarsia with the great big eyes. So this really attracted this Jesuit priest. So he drew a picture of it to send back to his friends and his colleagues in Britain. But I think he took some liberty here, because in this one, he shows a female tarsia who's tied her baby to her stomach with some vines around it. Right? I think his idea was to show the maternal care that's you can make a lot of that picture. And this is from the British Library, from Annabelle Gallup's wonderful blog. But she put on this image, the calligraphic heading from the Sultan of Brunei's diary, a wonderful diary, and we're talking about global connections. it's quite clear in that diary that more and more people are making the Hajj in the late 18th century because they're coming to ask for permission to go. But he's made this image of a ship, or his scribe has made this image of a ship using the Arabic phrase, his word is the truth, his speech, veracity. And it's a reminder, I think, of the importance of the seas, of the maritime connections that link so much of this world together. So there are great possibilities for the next generation of scholars. There's much to be done, and I think we'll leave it there for now. But I think we have some time for questions.
Certainly. Questions, and then after the questions, just go out and turn to your left and a little bit around. You'll find there will be a table set up, and we will have the reception there. So, questions first, and then the reception afterwards.
I have one. When we all started, the way to view Southeast Asia was based on kind of the cosmological state. Then we have Walter's mandala states. Then we have, Tambaya's galactic states. Now we have the Watson Andaya.
No, I think.
Can you address that a little bit? How the zone is a better way of conceptualizing space?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, of course, what Heine Geldern and Walters and Tambaya were talking about is kind of the organization of the community. And that still holds for us. I mean, what we see is a large number of mandala polities, if you want to use Walter's term, in this area. But we also see that within these large number of polities, there are connections, meaningful connections. And that's where we drew the zones. We base it a lot on our own research, but also people working in the area. For example, when you look at what we call the Eastern mainland, we saw that there were quite a lot of connections between Vietnam as well as southern China, or the Cham areas with some of the other areas around the region. So that we incorporated that as a zone, but with the realization that these kinds of even landed boundaries were not sufficient. That you've got to also talk in terms of the sea boundaries, or you could talk in terms of these zones along the sea. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, the meaningful connections. So the mandalas are still there. We're not creating anything new. We're just kind of saying, yes, the mandalas are there, but in order to kind of look at it in a bigger way, let's look at the meaningful connection.
And I think this is a textbook, so you have to have some kind of organization. You can't just throw. Students are not just sitting there and throwing something to their mouths. But these boundaries are just. They're just very, of course they're overlapping. We've tried to strengthen the interconnections between the boundaries as well. But it is principally a way, partially a way of organizing the material, but around zones that we thought were meaningful, that they actually meant something. And I mean, if you take the Western Archipelago and the Central Archipelago, it's very clear in the sources that the Malays, however you define them, and the Javanese saw themselves as rivals. They saw them, so they placed. So it becomes a meaningful kind of boundary zone to use.
I wanted to also related to boundaries. When I think of early Southeast Asia, the first main question, it seems to me, is the gradual movement of rice culture from the mainland down into the rest of the Southeast Asia, which you don't say much about. But rice culture is replacing root crop, tree crop culture. It's rice replacing taro. And in order to grow rice, you have to cooperate. So the whole society changes once you move into a rice culture from a tree crop, root crop. And some of these people are still on a tree crop, root crop culture down at the end.
We give a lot of attention to that because we argue that once you start growing rice, wet rice, the society changes significantly because you can't buzz off, you can't plant the rice and buzz off. You've got to be there monitoring the irrigation system. You've got a fixed population that's easy to tax, easy to marshal for armies and so forth. But the advent of new crops like corn enables people to move into areas, quite marginal areas, so it extends population beyond areas that were habitable previously. The rise of rice as a prestige food means that sago, which was previously in the 15th century, people along the east coast of Sumatra and later into the ate sago as their main food.
Okay, glad you didn't forget it.
So it's there.
No, I was just going to say that also one tends to see Southeast Asia as rice eating. The areas that I've been doing research in the East, sago is the primary food. One of the things I always tell my students is that I remember my dad, when he couldn't have rice for food, he always said, "Oh, it does, I don't feel right, it's not filling." You go to Eastern Indonesia and say, "Oh, if you eat rice, you don't feel good. You have to have sago." So it's all what people are used to, and so and rice they'll eat in special occasions and so forth, but they still prefer sago as a kind of a meal.
Tamara had a question.
I think it takes not just courage, but a lot of energy to write a book like this. And I wonder first, how many pages is it? Relate to the next question.
About
400.
400, but that's including the bibliography, right? Including the further reading.
You had to remember.
Yes.
I have a two-part question somewhat related to that. First, you have to exclude a lot, and so I wondered if you could talk about how you thought about what you would exclude. And second, you've both written about sexuality and gender, and I'm wondering how you integrate that into the early modern period, because the other books about that period either kind of bracket it or don't really include it. So I was wondering if you could speak to those issues.
Well, we were very conscious that we needed to include something about gender and sexuality. So, of course, in terms of liminality, in terms of transsexual or transgender religious figures, we do try to give attention to those. Of course, with the early modern period, as far as powerful women are concerned, we're very constrained by the sources, but we do give a lot of attention to the idea of the state as a family writ large, and so the use of kinship terms in relation to the family. But we also note that leadership is often associated with physical prowess, and that very often then privileges men. So we don't want to force leadership. You can't go in with a rah-rah kind of banner and say, "I'm going to winkle out all the women that I can ever find." That wouldn't work. And so when women appear naturally, and when concerns with gender and sexuality appear naturally, which they do very, very frequently, they are included. We have a wonderful picture from Johann Newhoff's book of trade in Malacca in the 17th century, and it has a woman bartering with an Indian trader, because the point is that women control the marketplace principally. So I think it's there. Perhaps it's not sufficient to satisfy some people, but we're fairly confident that it was true enough to the sources that, and the balance is right. And as far as the exclusion, yes, that's you want to...
Yes, I think in early modern it's a little bit easier than doing the contemporary 19th century because there isn't really that much. Where we found an interesting decision was in Thailand. I mean, you know a lot about Thailand, but it was because of the kind of writings by the Germans, where they're looking at the peripheral Thai states to the north. And so, you know, we were focusing on really the Lower Manoa Basin and all these kingdoms that people usually focus on. Then all of a sudden, this information came out, and what their sources seem to indicate is that these were powerful. These were transcending the southern China, the northern Burma, and northern Thailand areas. And they were big polities and very powerful with multicultural communities. And so this is what was one of the reasons why we wanted to incorporate it, because we felt this would then give another view of the way the Thais were developing within the Southeast Asian region. Some of the areas we had so little that we had to take whatever we could find. And so it was more trying to make sense of what was there and try to kind of make a meaningful narrative without stretching it too much. And so because I had worked with the sea peoples and so forth, and one of my students just recently completed a thesis on the Samabaja from the 17th century. And he indicated that enormous linkages that they had. In fact, they were the most important people within the Goa kingdom and the Golay kingdom, which is powerful kingdoms, in the same way that the sea peoples were for the Malacca, the Malay kingdoms. And so we tried to make the point that what one has to do is to look at communities during the period in which they functioned. And we tried to show, for example, that as the trade elements disappeared, for example, sea products and forest products, as this disappeared or became less important, then the importance of these groups declined, and then you get the views of the center looking down upon these people. So this is the kind of thing we try to do, but you're right. I mean, it's always a difficult case trying to decide what to leave in and what to leave out. But you know, fortunately, there were enough good material that we could have done.
But I think when you're talking about what to include and what to exclude, it's the detail of the narrative. That, I mean, you could write, and people, and Professor Rickles has, write whole books about Java itself. So how do you collapse that period into 20 pages, for example? You know, so it's particularly in well-documented areas. It was questions of, and you can always be faulted on that. Why didn't you mention X or Y or Z? So that it was more that at that level that we were trying to make decisions in the actual narrative rather than the general features.
Barbara tells me I knew it was Eric White, the persistent hand in the back.
So I'd like to ask, in the spirit of Oliver Walters, a comparative question. So you mentioned towards the end that you discovered that some of these defining historical features and processes in the region had similarities or resonances with other regions of the globe. So I'm wondering, did you also find, nonetheless, anything unique about the character and dynamics of these features and processes vis-a-vis other regions, maybe in terms of trajectory or pace or scale or intensity or configuration or something? Or is it a similar story in the early modern era in Southeast Asia versus East Asia, South Asia, other parts of the world?
I think one of the differences, of course, is that even the features that we identify were not uniformly, so it's not that every single society experienced global connections, and in more integrated areas, then you would find, we did find that there were some features, for example, in Europe, the advance in literacy is very noticeable. And perhaps you can find that, and that's considered to be one of the features of this period in the European area. And and you could say that to a limited extent in some places in Southeast Asia. It doesn't mean that there's an absolute match. And, you know, to make those kind of comparisons, what you need is somebody else to write a history, for example, of the early modern Spanish Empire, or the early modern, or Latin America, say, or early modern Africa. And as far as I know, that hasn't. Could you generalize across Africa? Probably not, but you could write in terms of sub-regions and may be able to reach some sort of, at least for the northern African area and the southern African. Doesn't answer your question, but...
in fact, it was one of the questions that stymied us also. We gave part of this talk in Holland. And there was the same question from a Chinese early modern historian. So one of the things, we've been thinking about this stuff, one of the points that we make about in the book is the strength of localization. It's a term that Walters used as well, which is the way that Southeast Asians would take an outside idea and make it their own by adapting it and then adopting it. And so one of the things that I think is very unique to Southeast Asia is the fact that you don't have, I guess, Ben Anderson was talking about this kind of Latin culture, or others were talking about Sanskritic culture and so forth. We didn't have that singular type of dominant philosophical over culture within the area. And so what I think Southeast Asia had far more than many other regions is a huge number of different kinds of cultures coming in at the same time. You got Hinduism, you had Buddhism, you had Christianity, and then you had very strong indigenous religions. And so I think, in a sense, Southeast Asians, the response to the global network, I think, is where Southeast Asia was different. And so you can find a large variation of responses to the same impetus coming from the outside. So you can look at what is happening in Eastern Indonesia, the way they looked at Christianity, for example, and looked at Buddhism in Thailand. You can see all the different kinds of ways in which they adapted. So I think in that case, Southeast Asia is unique. And that's why it's very hard to generalize oftentimes about that. It's a good question. I think it's something that we'll have to keep on thinking about, and hopefully others will help us. Why is Southeast Asia so different? And I think it's the method in which they went about localizing, which I think is very unique.
Yeah, I have a question. Leonard mentioned early on about Islamization in, my guess would be, the Malay Peninsula, maybe more than other parts of Malaysia, but I don't know, Sumatra, Java. And I wondered whether, if I were a Muslim in Malaysia 50 years ago, and that, or let's say that kind of, I don't know how to put this question, this is hard. What I'm trying to get at is, does a not particularly Salafi-leaning Muslim look upon the Salafis as more Muslim? Are they somehow more Islamic? Which, I mean, you can see this with very Orthodox Jews, that a more secular Jew will look upon those more Orthodox Jews as somehow more Jewish, which to me is a really odd idea of what makes a person more or less than what they already are. Is that something you've noticed?
Yes, of course they do have Salafi groups in Malaysia as well as in Indonesia, but they're considered to be a kind of a small group. And one of the things that's very striking about Islam, we just came back from a conference in Jakarta sponsored by the State University of Islam, where they talked about moderation as a model that Southeast Asia can provide for the rest of the Islamic world. And one of the things that helps these groups, and when I talk about Islamization in Malaysia, what I'm talking about is increasing Islamic ideas in government, in the judiciary, in the schools, and so forth and so on. But that Islamization is cutting out the Salafi groups. The more radical groups are being cut out and left out because of the powerful movement of Islam in these areas. So if you look at the schools, Islam is the official religion in Malaysia. But as I pointed out, it's not the state religion. And so what happens is that schools teach Islam as a matter of course. And so what has happened is that as the society becomes more Muslim, it introduces more Islamic courses, but many of the Muslim parents want their kids to be prepared for the modern world. So you get secular courses alongside Muslim courses, Islamic courses, and this has been very successful. And this is also happening in Indonesia. And so this is where the Islamization is occurring. Where it is very difficult and where it's problematic in Malaysia is that some of the ones who are pushing Islamization want Islamization to be followed by everybody in society, whether you're Muslim or not. So that if they're talking about how, for example, this close proximity of two sexes, they would want that to be imposed not only on Malays, but on not only Muslims, on non-Muslims as well. So if you're a Christian, you still cannot go walking hand in hand if you're a man and a woman in public. So that it's this kind of thing that is going on. That's only one small example, but that's the kind of trend that's going on. Right?
And I think one of the most serious aspects is because the Sharia court system is now becoming more dominant in some cases than the secular court system. And this is particularly apparent in cases where, for example, in custody, which the Sharia courts previously dealt with. But if you have a wife who's non-Muslim and a husband who's Muslim, what happens to the children in the case of divorce? Should that go to the Sharia court or should it go to the secular court? So these kinds of issues now in the secular court, the judiciary was really very much undermined under Mahathir. So those kinds of issues are, the society, Malaysians are going to have to work these things out, but it's not so easy because if to be a Malay is to be a Muslim, if you start criticizing how Islam is interpreted, it's a very easy slide to be seen as criticizing Malays. And then that becomes a very difficult issue because it brings up race, ethnic issues as well. So there's no easy solution, I don't think. But the rise of civil society, hopefully, will see some solution in the future.
One more question, Tom?
Just a question about sources in the different areas and the proportion of European versus Southeast Asian sources. I know Zone 4 do a little better. I don't know the other zones so well. And there's been discussion about whether the Bugis have a more historical sense of time than the Southeast Asians. And you get into any of that, like indigenous senses of time and history change.
We do have a section on that in chapter 2, where we're talking about how once you accept a new religion or a new belief system, it introduces you to a new calendar, a new kind of holidays, and so you may amalgamate those with your existing belief system. But the Bugis' habit of keeping diaries, of course, is very useful. But it's also interesting that in their diaries they kept European dates as well. So you don't know where did that interest, was it always there, or was it encouraged because of their exposure to especially the Portuguese at an early stage? So I wouldn't like to. I think you're backing into a difficult corner if you start putting one group forward as better or more acute in some areas than others.
But there is, of course, one of the problems, of course, we don't know, I mean, all of you know how many languages there are in Southeast Asia. So we don't know, for example, the Thai historians who might have been writing about early modern. Our only hope is that some of the Western historians or Thai historians who are writing in English have incorporated some of the indigenous material. This is what we hope also for the rest of Southeast Asia. So that the ones that we can read, we try to read as much as we can. But because our languages are limited, we do have to rely on the fact that English sources written about the area on the period by scholars from that place or that area, or scholars from abroad will work on that area, and hoping that many of them have also used their indigenous sources. And that's the only thing we could do, because as you're right, there's just so much. And, you know.
We had to pick flowers, not pick flowers.
So we did pick a lot of flowers when writing this book.
Well, thank you so much.